What were the mysterious plagues of Egypt? Have you ever wondered how a series of plagues could bring down the mightiest civilization of the ancient world? The story of the 10 plagues of Egypt is one of the most enduring tales of the Bible, and it has captured the imagination of people for centuries. But what were these plagues, and why did they happen? Join us on a journey of discovery as we explore the secrets of God's power and the release of His people. And watch till the end to find out what was the horrifying last plague that shook the entire land of Egypt. The story begins with the Israelites living as slaves in Egypt. Their cries for help reach the ears of God, and He decides to intervene on their behalf. He sends Moses and his brother Aaron to demand the release of the Israelites, but Pharaoh refuses. God then sends a series of 10 plagues to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. These plagues are mysterious and terrifying, and they strike at the heart of the Egyptian society. The first plague is the turning of the Nile River into blood, making it impossible for the Egyptians to drink or use for any purpose. The Lord said,
"By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hands I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink, and the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water."
The waters of the Nile were turned to blood, killing fish and other aquatic creatures, and making the water undrinkable. This event lasted for 7 days, causing widespread panic and chaos throughout the land. It's important to note that the Nile was also considered a sacred river in Egyptian religion, associated with the goddess Hapi and the pharaoh's power. By turning the Nile into blood, God was demonstrating His superiority over the Egyptian gods and their supposed control over the natural world. The first plague was also a direct challenge to the authority of Pharaoh, who was seen as a divine figure with the power to control the Nile and other natural resources. God was sending a clear message that Pharaoh was not in control, and that only the Lord had the power to bring life and death. The first plague is followed by the infestation of frogs, which cover the land of Egypt and invade the homes of the Egyptians. According to the biblical account, the frogs were everywhere, covering the land, entering homes, and even invading the bedrooms of the Egyptians. The frogs were so abundant that they even caused a foul odor in the air, making life unbearable for the people of Egypt. It's important to note that the Egyptians had a special reverence for the frog, which they considered a symbol of fertility and regeneration. This made the infestation of frogs particularly insulting and humiliating for them. The plague of frogs was a clear demonstration of God's power, as He could easily control the behavior of these creatures and send them as a judgment upon the people of Egypt. The Lord used the frogs to show that the Egyptian gods were powerless and that only He had the power to control the natural world. The plague of frogs also served a practical purpose, as it paved the way for the third plague, the infestation of gnats or lice. The frogs died en masse, and their decomposing bodies became a breeding ground for the gnats, which then spread throughout the land. The third plague of Egypt was the infestation of gnats or lice, depending on the translation. This plague was a further escalation of the conflict between God and the Egyptian gods, as it targeted the god of the earth, Geb. According to the biblical account, Aaron stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the earth, which then became gnats or lice that covered the people and animals of Egypt. The gnats or lice were so small that they could not be seen with the naked eye, but their presence was felt through the irritation and discomfort they caused. This plague had a significant impact on the Egyptians, who were known for their personal hygiene and cleanliness. The gnats or lice made it difficult for the Egyptians to maintain their rituals and practices, further disrupting their way of life. The fourth plague of Egypt was the swarms of flies. According to the biblical account, God sent swarms of flies that covered the land of Egypt, except for the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. The flies were so thick that they filled the houses, covered the ground, and destroyed crops. This plague was a direct attack on the god of the sky, Khepri, who was often depicted as a scarab beetle. The scarab beetle was considered sacred by the Egyptians, and the swarms of flies would have been a repulsive and terrifying sight. The fifth plague of Egypt was a pestilence or disease that afflicted the livestock of the Egyptians. Exodus 9 verses 1-7 recounts how God instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh to release the Israelites or else he would send a pestilence on the livestock of Egypt. The pestilence was a devastating blow to the Egyptians, who relied heavily on their livestock for food, transportation, and even religious sacrifice. According to Exodus 9 verse 3, the pestilence affected all the livestock of the Egyptians, including horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep. The animals that were not killed outright by the disease were left weak and unable to work, causing further economic damage to the Egyptians. The sixth plague of Egypt was a severe outbreak of boils that struck both humans and animals. According to Exodus 9 verses 8 to 9, Moses and Aaron were instructed by God to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and sprinkle it towards the sky in the presence of Pharaoh. The soot then spread throughout the land and caused boils to break out on the Egyptians. The boils were extremely painful and caused intense suffering. Exodus 9 verse 10 describes how even the magicians who had previously imitated the miracles of God were unable to stand before Moses due to the boils on their bodies. The plague was so severe that it affected both humans and animals, causing the death of many livestock. As with the other plagues, the purpose of the boils was to demonstrate God's power and authority over Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods. In Exodus 9 verses 14 to 16, God declares to Pharaoh,
For this time I will send all my plagues on you, yourself, and on your officials, and on your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth.
The seventh plague of Egypt was a severe storm of hail and fire that struck the land, destroying crops and killing both people and animals. According to Exodus 9 verses 22 to 26, God told Moses and Aaron to stretch out their hands toward the sky, and hail rained down upon the Egyptians. The hail was so severe that it destroyed everything in its path, including crops, trees, and people. The book of Exodus describes it as the most severe hailstorm ever to hit Egypt.
The hail struck all that was in the field throughout all the land of Egypt, both human and animal. The hail also struck down all the plants of the field, and shattered every tree in the field.
The hail was accompanied by lightning and thunder, and the Egyptians were terrified. Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Israelites go, saying, "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" However, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he still refused to release the Israelites. The eighth plague of Egypt was a swarm of locusts. God instructed Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. When Pharaoh refused, God sent a swarm of locusts to devastate the land of Egypt. The locusts were described as covering the surface of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees. The swarm was so thick that it obscured the sun, plunging the land into darkness. However, this was soon followed by a truly horrifying darkness. The ninth plague. The ninth plague of Egypt was a darkness that covered the land for 3 days. According to Exodus 10 verses 21 to 29, God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand towards the sky, and a thick darkness descended over the land of Egypt, so that the people could not see each other and could not move around for 3 days. Despite the devastating effects of the darkness, Pharaoh still refused to release the Israelites. It was only after the final and most terrible plague that Pharaoh finally relented and allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt. The 10th plague of Egypt was one of the most devastating and horrifying events in the history of humanity. It was the culmination of a series of plagues that had struck the land of Egypt and had caused immense suffering and destruction. The 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. Every firstborn child in Egypt, both human and animal, was struck down by the hand of God in a single night. The cries of mourning and wailing filled the air as families were torn apart, and the streets were littered with the bodies of innocent victims. Imagine the horror of a mother waking up to find her firstborn son lying lifeless next to her. Or a father discovering his beloved daughter dead in her bed. The sounds of anguished parents and grieving families would have echoed throughout the land, and the stench of death would have been overwhelming. The 10th plague was a devastating blow to the pride and arrogance of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, who had refused to listen to God and had continued to oppress and enslave the Israelites. It was a final warning that God was not to be trifled with and that his judgment was swift and severe. But for the Israelites, the 10th plague was a moment of liberation and redemption. It marked the end of their long years of slavery and the beginning of a new chapter in their history as God's chosen people. The horror of the 10th plague was a necessary step towards their ultimate freedom, and it remains a powerful reminder of the awesome power and justice of God.